Well, do tell me, who was Alexander and what is this all about?
Alexander was born just over 100 years ago in 1869 in Tasmania. He was the eldest of 8 children, and they lived a very country life, and he had an early love of horses and horse riding, which stayed with him all his life, which was a long one. He died when he was 86. Another love of his life was the theatre. As a young child, he'd been rather sickly, and part of the time he didn't go to school. He had a private tutor, a Scotsman, who had a great love of Shakespeare, and maybe from him, Alexander himself got this love of Shakespeare, so that when he grew up, he decided that he would become a reciter, and he would do one-man recitals, dramatic, humorous monologues, which were very popular at that time. And he gave them in both Australia and New Zealand, and was beginning to make a name for himself when he was in his early 20s. But he began to have a recurring problem, and it was rather serious because he began to lose his voice. Particularly during these recitals, towards the end of the recital, he was getting quite hoarse. So he went to various medical people to see if they could give him help with this, but they could find nothing seriously wrong with his throat. But his own doctor suggested that he rest his voice, that he didn't speak before one of his recitals, that for 2 or 3 weeks he rested it completely and just wrote things down. And this he did quite meticulously, and he found on the night there was his voice large as life again. But towards the end of the evening it began to become hoarse again. And in fact he had what is known as clergyman's throat.
Oh yes, this is the problem clergymen always get from trying to project in a large building.
Yes, and of course that brings in one of Alexander's discoveries in a way, that if we think a greater demand is being made on us, we tighten up, and we shouldn't.
Yes.
It just makes it that much more difficult. So when he realized that if he rested his voice came back, he said to his doctor, well, what is it I'm doing? It must be something in the way I'm speaking which is producing this stress, you see, on the throat. And the doctor said, well, he hadn't any idea. And Alexander, being rather a remarkable man, he went home and decided he would try and find out. Now, it was an impossible task in a way, because he didn't know what he was looking for. So he had to look for everything and ignore nothing. And he set up a whole lot of mirrors. And what I'm describing to you in a few minutes took him about 10 years to sort out. But what he discovered was that as he thought, as he was about to speak, a pattern of interference came about in him. And he was able to analyze this as a tightening in the neck, a pulling back and down of the head, a shortening in stature. And he realized that this must have some significance in his voice problem, but he didn't know quite what. So he went about trying to change what was the habit of a lifetime, and he found it very difficult. It's easier in a way to give up smoking because it's something additional that we are doing to ourselves. But
yes, of course.
Talking, so fundamental.
It goes on all the time, doesn't it?
Yes, yes. So he, by this series of mirrors where he could watch what he was doing, he managed over a period of time to discipline himself so that he was able not to stiffen the neck and not to pull the head back and not to shorten in stature. Now, it wasn't as easy as it sounds, and he does describe it very well in his books. He calls it the evolution of his technique, of how he realized, for instance, that his feelings about what he was doing couldn't be trusted, that they were at that time unreliable. And he thought he was unusual in this. He thought it was just his problem he was working out. But we know now that what he worked out for himself is of use to all of us. Even if we have no specific problem,